Hey everyone, this is James and Ayesha, and our research project is titled The Effects of Ground Beef Leanness on Hamburger Juiciness and Consumer Ability to Differentiate.
So over the past few years, the intake of lean meat has increased in higher amount due to raised awareness that a higher intake of fatty meats can increase our risk of various chronic illnesses, some of which include type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and obesity. So organizations like the CDC and the USDA recommend that we choose lean cuts when we're consuming red meat. And by selecting lean meats, we can keep our saturated fat intake within recommendations and lower our risk of these chronic illnesses. So what is lean meat? In general, it refers to cuts of chicken, beef, turkey, and pork that have been trimmed of visible fat. Lean tissue refers to muscle, connective tissue, vitamins, and minerals present in the meat, whereas fat refers to just the fat or adipose tissue. And fat measure is basically indicated in the form of a ratio or percentage on the package of the meat. Like you can see on the right over here, there's a 910 package of ground beef sirloin, and 910 is synonymous to 90% lean, and it means 90% of the mass of meat comes from lean tissue and 10% comes from fat. And grocery stores sell a wide variety of ground meats with varying fat content.
So, there are several factors that contribute to the significance of why we chose to examine these. So, food perception, one of them, fat and muscle tissue are going to provide different experiences for how the consumer is going to perceive the different foods, how they're going to sense the foods, how they're going to taste it, smell it, all these different characteristics. Foods with more fat are going to have more pronounced measures of juiciness, greater amounts of tenderness, and then it's going to impact the flavor. Not saying it's going to have more flavor, but it will have a different flavor. The way that the food is prepared is going to be different. So, with different levels of fat, muscle tissue, water content, these are going to create different conditions that are going to require different approaches to cooking. For example, lean meats are going to generally require less time to cook. If you cook a leaner meat for the same amount of time that you cook a fattier meat, you will probably end up overcooking that leaner meat. So then, in terms of food cost, ground meats usually follow a trend in which the leaner version of the same amount of the product is going to be more expensive than the version that has more fat. So 96.4 is generally more expensive than 80/20. And there are examples of exceptions to this. For example, 90/10 is sometimes the most expensive, which you'd think like, well, why is 90/10 more expensive than 96.4 or 93.7 when it has more fat and less protein? And the reason for that is because the ideal cut of meat that will provide that 90 lean 10 fat ratio is going to come from a more expensive cut of beef. For example, a sirloin cut. Those sirloin cuts are more expensive, so the final product of the 90/10 ratio ground beef will therefore be more expensive. And then the overall health impact of just saturated fat intake and meat intake is associated with negative cardiovascular outcomes. Animal-based foods are the primary sources of saturated fat in almost all human dietary approaches, except for a few tropical plant sources. And choosing low saturated fat meats can have a significant effect on the total amount of fat and also saturated fat that one consumes.
So for our research, the objective was to examine juiciness and overall sensory differences in ground beef patty with varying leanness. So for this experiment, we chose two ground beef meats with varying leanness levels. One was the 80/20, which was the control, and the other was the 96.4, which was the experiment. And we used the cooking loss card to assess the juiciness of both these ground beef patties, and the triangle test was done to assess whether the participants could tell the difference between both of these meats. Our experimental question was, is there a difference in overall sensory properties and juiciness when we substitute an 80/20 lean ground beef for 96.4 lean ground beef in a simple hamburger recipe? And our hypothesis was that the participants won't be able to distinguish between the two leanness levels clearly, and that the 96.4 lean ground beef will have lower juiciness compared to the 80/20 lean ground beef due to lower fat content. So for the literature review, this review basically synthesized and evaluated the current research that was done on lean ground beef and sensory characteristics. So for lean beef and juiciness, a study conducted by Wong and Maga, they were basically examining the effects of fat content on the sensory qualities of ground beef patties. And the patties were prepared with varying levels of fat, 4%, 12, 20, and 30%. Trained sensory panelists assessed each treatment for variations in sensory characteristics, and the results showed that higher tenderness and juiciness values were associated with higher fat levels in the patties. Jordan also conducted a study to determine the effect of various lean fat ratios in ground beef on the sensory characteristics, the shelf life, and color. So the formulations were 90/10, 85/15, and 80/20 respectively, and the results showed that the 90/10 treatment group received lower juiciness ratings than those in the 85/15 and 80/20 treatment groups. For lean beef and sensory characteristics, there wasn't that many research articles on this. In fact, I couldn't really find much. But what I did find was a couple of studies in which one of them was Pullman, in which he conducted a study using a simulated retail display and taste sampling and compared the preferred fat content and color characteristics of labeled and unlabeled ground beef packages. So in terms of the sensory characteristics, the results showed that participants felt no significant difference across any of the blends. And then Davis comes to a similar conclusion when comparing the quality characteristics of the current plant-based protein ground beef alternatives to ground beef patties of varying fat percentages. The alternatives aside, the results for the ground beef patties of different fat levels basically showed that consumer sensory panelists weren't able to detect much difference between ground beef of varying fat content. However, the trained sensory panelists were able to identify and detect some differences, but considering that the consumer panelists weren't able to identify any differences, they were most likely not significant enough to begin with. So for the conclusion, basically ground meat, including beef, have more juiciness when there is a higher amount of fat present. And then the differences in sensory characteristics do exist between ground meat of varying leanness levels, but whether participants are able to point that out with clarity is still up in the air due to limited research on the topic. Our research had untrained participants to assess the differences between two types of ground beef patties, whereas most of the literature that I found had trained sensory panelists reviewing the differences. And our study also aimed to assess the juiciness via the fluid water content loss during the cooking process using the cooking loss card, which is another gap the literature didn't address. I wasn't able to find any articles on this particular experiment to assess the juiciness.
So the specific procedure that we followed was pretty basic. Terminology that was used in a lot of our labs was the basic recipe, and I went with a really basic recipe here for this. A hamburger is pretty basic as it is, but I tried to keep it as basic as possible. So if we look at the ingredients, we had a pound of 80/20 ground beef, hamburger buns, a piece of lettuce, and I cut it to be the exact same weight for each one, and then a very small amount of salt and pepper to be dispersed amongst the entire recipe. So for each of the ground beef patties, we made sure that they were exactly the same. They were all measured to the exactly 113 grams. I measured the height of all of them to make sure that the distribution, the density of these patties was all going to be the same. I tried to handle them as little as possible. And then I cooked them on a flat top cast iron surface to try to make it so that the water fat loss was going to be even. So if they were sitting on top of the grates differently, some of them may lose water differently. So I had them on a flat top surface to make it so that they would all be having the exact same amount of space underneath them and surface contact on the bottom. So they were all cooked to an internal temperature of 155 degrees. They were then removed and rested for 5 minutes before I created the sandwiches from them. And then I added the ingredients in the same order. We've had our patty on top of the bottom half of the bun, added lettuce, and then put the other piece of the bun on top of that. So the variations for this, we had our control, which was the 80-20. Our variation was the 96-4 lean burgers. And we can see the picture over there. On the left are the 80-20s, which have significantly more of a pink color, and the 96-4 on the right have a much more reddish color due to the leanness. So the two evaluations that we did, the first was to assess juiciness, which was on the cooking loss test. The fluid loss. And then the consumer ability to differentiate was done with the triangle test, which I will elaborate on in a second. So for the subjective evaluation, this was our triangle test. So I made all of the sandwiches, and I had this table on the right here. Each of the subjects I assigned a different sample order. C represents control, V represents variation. So some people had two versions of the control and one of the variation. Some people had two of the variation and one of the control. And they had to try and tell which one was different between the two. So some people were differentiating, trying to figure out if they had the control versus two variations, or if they had the variation versus two controls. And each person got 3/4 as represented in that triangle there, and they had to try and pick which one was different. And then they used the little, I created little pieces of paper that looked like the piece on the bottom, figure 2. So it says 2 of these hamburger samples are the same. Which one is different? Samples are numbered 1, 2, and 3, and they had to tell me which one was different. So this is what the hamburgers look like after I cut them, but then this is what it looked like as they received them. So they had to pick which one of those was different. And then for the cooking loss test, when I cooked all of them on the same flat cast iron skillet, they were weighed prior, all 113 grams. And then after cooking and giving 5 minutes of rest, I weighed each one individually. So this is how they were cooked, all like this. And this was towards the very end. You could see a significant amount of loss coming from those ones specifically at the bottom. So each one was measured individually, and then there was an average found for each one. And the statistical analysis that we did on this was an unpaired t-test to examine the relationship between amounts of cooking loss between the 80-20 and the 96-4. So the results for our triangle test, as you can see from this pie chart here, we had 10 total subjects. 5 of them were able to differentiate as seen in blue, or red, because it was the exact same. The unable to differentiate was also 5. So 5 of our subjects could tell, they were able to correctly identify which of the samples were different, and then the other 5 were unable to tell. And we'll elaborate a little bit more on some of the reasons as to why we think maybe things may have happened when we get to our discussion, but it was even down the middle. And then in terms of juiciness, regarding the cooking loss, we can see the first set of data on the left side, the effects regarding the weight remaining. The 80-20 cooked weight was less. So the average cooked weight was 80.75 grams, whereas the 96.4, that says control, that should say variation. The 96.4 was the variation. The cooked weight was an average of 85 grams. So they all started as 113 grams. So the percent remaining from the control was higher, meaning there was more loss from the 80-20, which we can see from the second set of data over here. This is the weight loss specifically. The 80-20 lost 32.25 grams from cooking, which is 28.5%, whereas the 96.4 lost 28 grams from cooking on average. Actually, those were all exactly the same. So it is the average, but every single one lost exactly the same. The 96.4 was very, very consistent, and that represented 24.8% of cooking loss. And the difference between those two, as after we did the statistical analysis, a p-value of 0.0596. And we can see the differences there on these bar graphs.
So the aim of our study was to assess the juiciness and overall sensory differences in ground beef patties with varying leanness. And as James said, 50% of our participants were able to clearly differentiate between the 80/20 and 96/4 ground beef patties in the cooked burgers. However, the other 50 could not distinguish between the two patties of varying leanness levels. And as mentioned before, there was a positive association between higher fat in ground beef and increased juiciness levels with a p-value of 0.0596, which is significant, but it isn't that significant. And very limited research on lean to fat ground beef ratios and consumers' ability to differentiate exist. I couldn't find anything, almost nothing on during my, like when I was writing the literature review. And from this, I was able to like assess that, further research needs to be done on how different cooking methods can influence sensory characteristics of ground beef patties and other meats as well, with varying leanness levels, and also the relationship between lean meat and palatability. And for our hypothesis on the consumer's ability to differentiate, this was unanswered by our study due to the 50/50 results, but our cooking loss test to assess the juiciness, our hypothesis was proven correct on that.
So for some strengths and limitations on on our study, this did address a few gaps in the literature, which is always a great factor to have, a great characteristic to have in a research project. The juiciness was assessed between two types of lean patty variations via the water and fluid content loss during the cooking process. We used untrained participants, which we could view as a strength, but it could also be viewed as a limitation, which I'll elaborate on a little bit over there. But it was truly examining people's perception, and the untrained person is going to be your general human population when it comes to eating food. A much larger population is going to be represented by untrained participants. And it addresses the importance of personal preference, because that is what a lot of food comes down to. Food choices come down to personal preference, and whether or not somebody is going to want to make the healthy switch can come down to personal preference. So some of the limitations, the sample size was small. We only had 10 people, and they varied in age and experience with food in general. It was my family and my neighbors, so they're all untrained, but it was people that just like live in my neighborhood. I don't have access to large groups of people. My SEL that I'm doing right now is at a school, and I couldn't just be like, "Hey, kids, I'm gonna feed you all random foods." So my access was my family and my neighbors, and the knowledge of the study. I was one of the subjects. I had my wife organize them in a way that was according to the way I had it on that table. So I didn't know what I was getting, but I knew what I was getting into, and I knew very well what I was looking for. So it was kind of hard for me to pretend I didn't know what I was looking for. And I was one of the ones who was able to tell, because I knew exactly what I was looking for. And one of my neighbors is a friend of mine, and we were just talking one day, and I explained what the study was about, and I kind of explained what we were looking for before I realized I was going to be including him in the study. So he also knew very well what he was looking for, and he's probably the most competitive person I've ever met in my life. So he was like determined to know which one was different. So he was really analyzing his taste. So me and him were two of the five who were able to differentiate. So in the future going forward, I probably would have not included myself and made sure to not disclose exactly what we were looking for, because I do feel that getting rid of me and him would have skewed the results more in favor of the subjects not knowing. And then you can see in the image, the image that I showed before, there was an uneven dripping. My grill was uneven, which I didn't know. All of the liquid eventually pooled up in the left-hand corner over here, so I was unable to collect the drippings individually, which is something that I did plan on trying to do. So in terms of cost, the ground beef prices, as we said before, the leaner cuts are going to be more expensive, which is what we saw here: $1.07 per serving for 80/20, and then $1.67 per serving of the 96.4, which results in a higher cost per serving of the 96.4 burger. But it's really not too much. 60 cents isn't really all that significant in terms of making the healthy choice. So I do think this is a good number in favor of using the leaner meats and making that choice in favor of your health.
So for the nutrient analysis, we basically entered all of our ingredients on Happy Forks. However, we weren't able to find a 96.4 version of lean ground beef, so we ended up going with the closest, which was 95.5. So from both the nutrition facts labels, like we can just see that the total fat, calories, and cholesterol levels are higher in the burger made with 80/20 ground beef compared with the one made with 95.5 ground beef, which was 96.4. But yeah, and this makes sense because obviously 80/20 has more fat than 95.5 or 96.4. And for carbohydrates, including the dietary fiber and the sugar, they all remain the same in both of the ground beef burgers, obviously because we were assessing protein, we were assessing meat. So there was not going to be any change in carbohydrates on that front. For the protein and iron levels are higher in the burger made with 95.5 compared with the one made with from 80/20 ground beef. And this is obviously due to the less fat. And obviously, of course, if there's less fat, then that means there'll be more protein. And if there's more protein, there'll be more iron. So yeah. So in conclusion, the results of our study basically provided evidence that higher levels of fat in ground beef are associated with higher levels of juiciness in the meat. And while there does exist differences in sensory characteristics between ground beef patties with varying fat levels, the results of our study indicated that an equal number of untrained participants could and couldn't distinguish between the two leanness levels clearly. And these results basically encourage using cooking loss method as a way to assess juiciness levels between the ground beef patties. And these results also encourage, the importance and necessity of using large-scale experimental studies to accurately determine whether untrained consumers can detect sensory differences in ground beef patties of varying fat content. And, just doing these experiments and stuff is very important to like get an accurate conclusion. Like when I was going through the literature review, I had like varying research. First, the research was limited on our topic to begin with, and then the results kind of differed between different researches. So doing these large scale experimental studies is very necessary to do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And here are our references.